King George III of the United Kingdom reigned as king from the 25th of October 1760 to the 29th of January 1820. His marriage to Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz resulted in 15 children, all of whom survived birth. This video will dive into the lives of all of his children. George IV was born in St. James's Palace in London on the 12th of August 1762. He was the eldest child of George III and his wife Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. He had 14 siblings. As the eldest son of the king, George was given the title of Prince of Wales a few days after his birth. He was academically gifted and had a knack for languages. He learned to speak French, German and Italian fluently alongside his native English. When he turned 18, George was given a separate estate to live in and threw himself into scandal very quickly. He loved to drink and loved women. His love for extravagance put him at odds with his father and mother, who lived generally scandal-free. Soon, George fell in love with Maria Fitzherbert, a widowed Catholic commoner, 6 years older than him. Because of the Act of Settlement 1701 and the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, he was unable to marry her by law due to her being a Catholic and not obtaining the king's consent. Despite this, the couple married in a secret ceremony in 1785. However, this marriage was null and void as the king's consent had not been sought nor given. Even though he had a large annual income, it was not enough to cover his living expenses. George's father refused to help him, and George had to move into Maria's home. The political allies of the prince helped him to obtain a huge grant from Parliament, which paid for his debts and home improvements. In 1788, George III's mental health deteriorated, and he was unable to carry out his duties. Parliament was suspended for a period of 2 months, and when Parliament reconvened, the king was unable to open Parliament. As such, Parliament passed the Regency Bill, which allowed the Prince of Wales to act as a regent on behalf of his father. However, by this point the king had recovered, and the Prince of Wales did not need to become regent. As George's debts grew, his father offered him an ultimatum: marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick and his debts would be paid. The prince agreed, and on the 8th of April 1795, George and Caroline were wed. Because George's marriage to Maria Fitzherbert was not considered legal, George was able to marry Caroline. The marriage was unhappy and the couple were not compatible. However, they did their duty, and their only child, Princess Charlotte, was born in 1796. After the birth of their daughter, the couple remained separated, and George continued to liaise with his various mistresses and Maria Fitzherbert. George was rumoured to have had several illegitimate children, including James Ord, who was a Jesuit priest, Captain Henry A.F. Hervey, Major George Seymour Crowell, William Hampshire, and Charles Bow Candy. However, he never explicitly claimed them as his children, so it's only speculation. In 1804, George and Caroline fought over the custody of their daughter. This dispute led to an inquiry being made into Princess Caroline's conduct after George accused her of adultery, resulting in the birth of an illegitimate son. Their daughter was eventually placed in the care of George III, and Caroline was cleared of the charge. In 1810, George's youngest sister Amelia died, and it broke his father. George III never recovered from the death of his beloved daughter, and his mental health deteriorated. He would be incapacitated for the rest of his life. Parliament granted a new bill, the Regency Act of 1811, which named George as the Prince Regent. He was effectively king in all but name. George let his ministers do as they pleased in government and took on a smaller role than his father had. He established the principle of the Prime Minister being the person that was supported by the majority of Parliament, even if the monarch disagreed with the choice. It was expected that George would support the Whigs in their pursuit of Catholic emancipation, but he chose not to. In 1812, the Prime Minister Perceval was assassinated and Lord Liverpool was appointed as Prime Minister. In 1814, the electorate of Hanover was raised to a kingdom, and the war in continental Europe against Napoleon I, the French Emperor, ended in a French defeat. In 1817, Princess Charlotte died after giving birth to a stillborn son. The death of his only legitimate child would haunt George for the rest of his life, and would throw the succession into crisis. Charlotte was the only legitimate grandchild of George III, and her death prompted the unmarried sons of George III to marry and try to produce a child. During his reign as the Prince Regent, George popularised a new style of clothing and housing, became known as the Regency style. In 1820, George III died, and George, the Prince Regent, ascended the throne as George IV. By this point, George was obese and addicted to laudanum. George refused to recognise his estranged wife as queen, and he refused her entry for his coronation on the 19th of July, 1821. He sought a divorce, but decided to not go forward with the divorce as his various adulterous relationships might have come to light. On the 7th of August, 1821, Caroline died. George's coronation was extravagant and cost a whopping £23 million in today's currency. For the first time since Richard II, George visited Ireland in 1821, followed by Scotland. George IV spent much of his reign in Windsor Castle. In 1827, the Prime Minister retired and George Canning became the Prime Minister. The question of the Catholic emancipation was one of the biggest dilemmas to face George IV. He was anti-Catholic. Canning died in 1827, and Lord Goderic, followed by the Duke of Wellington, both became Prime Ministers that year and the following year. Wellington knew that the emancipation would happen eventually, and a Catholic relief bill was passed in 1829. However, it was not without controversy. Despite giving consent for the bill, under pressure from his anti-Catholic brother Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, the king withdrew his approval and cabinet resigned in protest. Under intense political pressure, the king eventually agreed to the bill and cabinet were given back their positions. George was a heavy drinker and eater, and at one point he weighed 20 stone. Later in life he developed gout, arteriolosclerosis, dropsy and porphyria. In his final years he spent many days in bed and had difficulty breathing. To help with his pain, the king took laudanum, developing an addiction that left him in a mentally impaired state. By the end of his life, he had lost sight in one eye and was confined to bed. However, his appetite for food remained till the very end. During the early hours of the 26th of June 1830, George IV passed away from upper gastrointestinal bleeding. Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, was born on the 16th of August 1763 at St. James's Palace. He was the second child of King George III and Queen Charlotte. He was 6 months old when his father elected him as Prince Bishop of Osnabrück in Lower Saxony. The bishopric of Osnabrück was ruled alternately by a Catholic bishop and a Protestant bishop from the Duchy of Brunswick-Luneburg. As Frederick's father was also the Elector of Hanover, he got to choose who would be the bishopric. Frederick was created a Knight of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath in 1767 and a Knight of the Garter in 1771. Frederick was brought up and educated with his elder brother at Kew Palace. Robert Darcy, the 4th Earl of Holderness, was their governor, and William Markham, Bishop of Chester, was their chief tutor. After Markham became the Archbishop of York, Richard Hurd, Bishop of Worcester, became their chief tutor. Princes spent 8 hours a day with their tutors and learned to ride and fence. In 1780, it was decided that Frederick would serve in the army, and he was made a colonel. Frederick was sent off to Hanover for military training under the supervision of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Fulk Greville. From 1781 to 1787, Frederick lived in Hanover, where he participated in manoeuvres and attended the University of Göttingen with his brothers Edward, Ernest, Augustus and Adolphus. By 1784, Frederick reached the rank of colonel. On the 27th of November 1784, Frederick was created Duke of York and Albany and Earl of Ulster, and became a member of the Privy Council. In 1787, upon his return to England, Frederick took a seat in the House of Lords. When his father's mental health deteriorated and the Regency Bill was proposed, Frederick strongly opposed it. Frederick married Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia on the 29th of September 1791 in the Charlottenburg Palace. A second wedding ceremony was held in Buckingham Palace on the 23rd of November 1791. The marriage was unsuccessful. Frederick was unfaithful and the couple were unable to have children. In 1794 the couple separated but remained on friendly terms and never caused any scandals together. In 1793 Frederick was promoted to full general. That year the Flanders campaign began and lasted until 1793. It was a coalition of military forces along the French borders, with the goal to invade France and stop Napoleon's First French Republic. Frederick was commander of the British forces, and after many successes and defeats, Frederick was recalled to England in 1795. Eventually, the coalition was forced to withdraw. A well-known nursery rhyme was inspired for Frederick's defeat at the Battle of Turcoing. In 1795, Frederick was promoted to Field Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of the forces of Great Britain and Ireland. He instituted a number of reforms in the British Army, and in 1801 he founded the Royal Military College in Sandhurst for training infantry and cavalry officers. He was also in charge of the preparations against Napoleon's planned invasion of the United Kingdom in 1803. Frederick's many reforms enabled the British Army to be stronger than ever before, and this proved helpful in the Peninsular War, which finally defeated Napoleon. In 1803, Frederick began an affair with Mary Ann Clark. In 1809, the charges were brought against Frederick in the House of Commons by Gwilym Wardle. These charges claimed that Frederick allowed Clark to influence him in the granting of commissions in the British Army. This caused a national scandal when Clark testified that she had sold army commissions with Frederick's knowledge. Frederick was acquitted of any implications, but resigned anyway as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. In 1811, George III was deemed unfit to reign, so Frederick's older brother George reigned as Prince Regent until their father's death. George reappointed Frederick as Commander-in-Chief on the 29th of May 1811. From then on, Frederick exercised strict impartiality with officer commissions and promotions. In 1817, Princess Charlotte of Wales, Frederick's only living legitimate niece, died after delivering a stillborn son. This caused a succession crisis. Despite the fact that George III had 15 children, and 12 of them were still alive by this point, only one, George, had produced a legitimate child, Princess Charlotte of Wales. Unless Frederick's brother had another child, Frederick would be heir presumptive upon his father's death. Frederick's unmarried brothers rushed to find brides, but any children born to them would be behind Frederick in the line of succession. In 1819, Frederick was entrusted with the care of his father, who by this point was blind, deaf, and suffering from dementia. King George III died on the 29th of January 1820, and Frederick's brother became King George IV. Frederick's wife died on the 6th of August 1820, and Frederick never remarried. On the 5th of January 1827, Frederick passed away at the age of 63. William IV was born on the 21st of August 1765 at Buckingham House as the third child of King George III and Queen Charlotte. At this point he had two older brothers, George and Frederick. William was never expected to inherit the throne. He had 12 younger siblings. Educated by private tutors as a child, once he turned 13 he joined the Royal Navy as a midshipman. His experiences in the Navy were not much different from any other midshipman, although he did have a tutor on board. During the American War of Independence, William served in New York. In 1785 he became a lieutenant and the following year a captain. That year he was stationed in the West Indies. William wanted to be created a duke like his brothers, but his father was reluctant to allow this. William threatened to stand for the House of Commons, and his father created him Duke of Clarence and St Andrews and Earl of Munster to stop this. William ceased active service in the Navy in 1790, and when Britain declared war on France in 1793, he was eager to serve. He expected to be given a position of command, but that was not to be, as he had broken his arm falling down some stairs and gave a speech in the House of Commons opposing the war. William never held a position of command throughout the Napoleonic Wars. The closest he came to actual fighting was in 1813 when, watching the bombardment of Antwerp, he came under fire and a bullet lodged itself in his coat. After the Navy, William spent time in the House of Lords. He opposed the abolition of slavery and was racist and xenophobic, especially towards French people. From 1791, William had a sexual and romantic relationship with an actress called Dorothea Jordan. They lived together and had 10 children. As they were not married, none of William's children were eligible in the line of succession. In 1797, William was given the position of Ranger of Bushy Park, which included a large house, large enough to accommodate his growing family. Between 1825 and 1827, William had Clarence House built. William and Dorothea's relationship ended in 1811. She was given a financial allowance every year and custody of their daughters on the condition that she never act again. However, Dorothea resumed acting in order to pay one of her daughter's husband's enormous debt. William discovered this and took custody of their daughters and stopped paying Dorothea. Dorothea's career began to fail, and to escape her creditors, she fled to France, where she died in 1816 in poverty. William also had one illegitimate son before his relationship with Dorothea. His name was William, and he drowned off Madagascar in 1807. Deep in debt, William attempted to marry a wealthy heiress, but was unsuccessful. In 1817, William's niece, Princess Charlotte of Wales, the second in line to the British throne and only legitimate grandchild of George III, died. It seemed more likely as time went on that William would eventually become king and he would need an heir. In 1818, William married the young Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, and though they were married for almost 20 years, they had no surviving children together. For the first year of their marriage, they lived in Germany, as it was much cheaper than Britain. Their marriage was a happy one, and William is not known to have had any extramarital affairs. In 1820, George III died, and William's eldest brother, the Prince of Wales and Prince Regent since 1811, became King George IV. In 1827, William's next oldest brother, Frederick, died, and William became heir presumptive. He was much healthier than George, and it seemed like only a matter of time before William would be king. The Prime Minister, George Canning, appointed William to the office of Lord High Admiral. William had arguments with the Admiral Council, and it came to a head when in 1828 William put a squadron of ships to sea without a word of where they were going. The king ordered that he resign from his position. William did as he was told. During this time, as Lord High Admiral, he abolished the Cat o' Nine Tails for most offences aside from mutiny, improved the standard of naval gunnery, and established regular reports on the condition and preparedness of each ship. He also commissioned the first steam warship. On the 26th of June 1830, George IV died, and William became King William IV. Unlike his brother, William lived in London for most of his reign and was very popular. He was not afraid to ask questions if it was necessary, and he was down to earth and much more approachable than previous kings had been. He did not have an indulgent appetite and gave much of his brother George's art collection to the nation. William tried to give Buckingham Palace away twice, but was turned down in both instances. Upon taking the throne, William created his children the titles of a child of a Marquess and his eldest son the Earl of Munster. When William came to the throne, the reform crisis was in full swing. In the election of 1830, Wellington was defeated in the House of Commons and Lord Grey replaced him as Prime Minister. Very little had changed in the electoral system since the 1400s. Many large towns had no elected members of parliament, while small boroughs had many elected members of parliament, which was highly unfair and undemocratic. The first reform bill was defeated in the House of Commons in 1831, and the Prime Minister urged William to dissolve Parliament. William was hesitant to do so, as Parliament had only just been elected the previous year. However, he was also irritated by the conduct of the opposition, and so William went to the House of Commons and dissolved Parliament. New elections were held and the bill passed through the House of Commons. However, it stalled in the House of Lords. The King's coronation occurred on the 8th of September 1831. It was not as extravagant as his brother's had been. He spent only £16,000 compared to his brother spent £240,000 on his coronation. William would have preferred to have not had a coronation at all, but not given much of a say in the matter. The second reform bill also failed to pass through the House of Lords. Grey suggested that William create more peers to ensure that the bill passed, but William refused. He had already created over 20 new peers in his coronation honours. However, he eventually and reluctantly agreed and created new titles for the eldest sons of peers already in the House of Lords, so that the titles would eventually be absorbed as subsidiary titles. It was not rejected outright, but the Lords began to change parts of the bill. When Grey and his fellow ministers threatened to resign if the king did not create a large enough amount of peers to force the bill, William accepted the resignation. The 1832 Reform Act eventually passed. William was also King of Hanover and ruled from London. There was a common misconception at the time that Britain dictated Hanoverian policy, but this was not true. In 1833, William signed a new constitution for Hanover, which empowered the middle class, gave some power to the poor, and expanded the role of Parliament. However, much of this would be revoked by his successor and brother, Ernest Augustus. William and his wife Adelaide were fond of William's niece Alexandrina Victoria of Kent, or more commonly referred to Victoria. They attempted to forge a close relationship with her, but were thwarted by the Duchess of Kent, Victoria's mother. The king thought the Duchess was disrespectful towards him, and at his final birthday banquet in August 1836, he expressed his hope aloud to everyone present that he hoped he would live until Victoria turned 18, so that the Duchess would never be regent. Victoria and the Duchess were so shocked that Victoria burst into tears and the Duchess sat in silence for the rest of the meal. William's eldest daughter, Sophia, Lady de Lisle and Dudley, died in childbirth in April 1837, and it shook William. 2 months later, on the 20th of June 1837, William passed away. His niece Victoria of Kent became Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, while William's younger brother Ernest Augustus became King of Hanover. Charlotte, Princess Royal, was the eldest daughter of George III. She was born on the 29th of September, 1766. Her parents had only sons by this point, and when she was born, they were delighted to have a daughter for once. Like all her siblings, Charlotte was inoculated against smallpox in 1768. As the eldest daughter of the monarch, it was assumed by most that Charlotte would marry someone important, and her education was considered to be of the utmost importance. She started her formal education at only 18 months old, learning languages, history, geography, music, art, needlework, and spinning. Her parents loved to show off their children, and when she was 3 years old, Charlotte took part in her first tableau, where she danced with her older brother George. They continued to show off their children, which made Charlotte very uncomfortable. After a bad event where a hearse was driven into the palace courtyard, the king and queen decided to never repeat the experience. Charlotte grew up under a strict regime imposed by her mother. She woke up early, ate plain food, and was never let out of her parents' sight. Court life was monotonous. The monotony was interspersed with outings to places like the Royal Academy, Oxford University, and Egham races. They sometimes watched plays or listened to musical concerts at home or at the theatre. Charlotte was shy and lacked confidence. As the oldest, her mother expected her to be responsible for her younger sisters. This made her unpopular with them, as she was inclined to make up stories about them to her parents. She was insecure and hated being teased. She felt her parents did not love her as much as her other siblings. She felt like a slave rather than a daughter and grew increasingly bitter over her mother. The princesses were rarely allowed to interact with members of the opposite sex. They felt it was more of a nunnery than a palace, and all of them yearned for freedom. When Charlotte was young, the family was small, and her parents got to spend more time with each of her siblings. However, the family soon grew, and her father suffered from deteriorating mental health. Her childhood was not as utopian as her parents had wished for her. On the 18th of May 1797, Charlotte was wed to Frederick, hereditary Prince of Wurttemberg. In December of that year, Frederick became the Duke of Wurttemberg. Frederick and Charlotte had one stillborn daughter together. After the French army occupied Wurttemberg in 1800, the Duke and Duchess fled to Austria. In 1801, Frederick concluded a treaty with France, and they returned to Wurttemberg. He also became the Elector of Wurttemberg in 1803. In exchange for providing France with a large armed force, Napoleon, the Emperor of the French, recognized Frederick as the King of Wurttemberg in 1805, and he assumed his throne on the 1st of January 1806. Frederick's joining of the Confederation of the Rhine made Frederick enemy of his father-in-law, George III. Incensed by his son-in-law's assumption of the title of king, George refused to address his daughter as Queen of Wurttemberg. In 1813, Frederick changed sides and went over to the Allies. In 1816, Frederick attended the Congress of Vienna, where he was confirmed as the king. He died in October of that year. After the death of her husband, Charlotte continued to live at Ludwigsburg Palace, and in 1819 she became a godmother of her niece Princess Victoria of Kent, the future Queen Victoria. In 1827, Charlotte returned to England to have surgery for dropsy. While in London, Charlotte lived in St. James's Palace and made visits to her family. She returned to Wurttemberg in October 1827 and passed away a year later on the 6th of October 1828. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, was born on the 2nd of November 1767, the fourth son and fifth child of the 15 children of King George III and Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Edward was first educated at home by the Reverend John Fisher, before he was educated in Lemberg, Hanover and Switzerland. In 1785, Edward began his military training with the Hanoverian Guards. In 1790, Edward arrived back in England without permission, and his father immediately sent him to serve in the 7th Regiment of Foot in Gibraltar. While in Geneva, Switzerland, Edward met Julie de Montgenet de Saint-Laurent, who was his mistress from 1790 until 1818. After Edward got married in 1818, Julie moved to Paris. There was no evidence of any children born from this relationship, but several families in Canada came descent from Edward and Julie. In 1791, Edward was transferred to an army position in Canada, and Julie accompanied him. The couple were popular in Canadian society, and they remained there until 1798, when Edward was allowed to return to England. In 1802, Edward was appointed Governor-General of Gibraltar. He was harsh to the army forces, and this led to serious consequences. On Christmas Day, he refused to allow the army garrison to celebrate with alcohol, and it led to bloodshed after the soldiers became mutinous. Edward was recalled to England, but retained the title of Governor-General of Gibraltar for the rest of his life. Edward was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal and was appointed Ranger of Hampton Court Park. Following the death of his only legitimate niece, Princess Charlotte of Wales in 1817, the rest of George III's unmarried sons sought out marriages. George III's daughters were too old by this point to possibly produce a child, and several of his sons were already in childless marriages. Only Prince William, Prince Edward, and Prince Adolphus were unwed, and all three got married in 1818. Edward broke off his relationship with Julie and focused on his new wife, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, whom he married on the 29th of May, 1818. Upon their marriage, Edward became a stepfather to her 2 children from her first marriage. They had a second ceremony on the 13th of July, 1818 at Kew Palace. They lived the first few months of marriage in Lenigan, where Victoria's son was the sovereign prince. But once Victoria became pregnant, they moved to England, where their only child was born on the 24th of May, 1819, Victoria. Edward was proud of his infant daughter and leased Woolbrook Cottage as the family's home. In early January 1820, Edward caught a cold, and within days it worsened. He developed pneumonia, and his condition was worsened by the doctors forcing him to undergo bleeding and cupping. Eventually he died on the 23rd of January 1820, just 6 days before the king died. He left very little to his wife and daughter, only debts, which his daughter paid off once she became queen. Princess Augusta Sophia was the 6th child of George III and Queen Charlotte, and their second daughter. She was born on the 8th of November 1768 in Buckingham House. Like all of her siblings, she was inoculated against smallpox. Augusta and her sisters were educated at home, under their mother's watchful eye, by governesses and tutors. They received an education in languages, history, geography, music, art, needlework, and spinning. Augusta was lively and extroverted. She was energetic and loved to play cricket and football with her brothers. She was charming, genuine, and humorous. The princesses were rarely allowed to interact with members of the opposite sex. What made matters worse was that their father limited their prospects by not allowing them to marry either Catholics nor commoners. The king found fault with any suitor brought forward for Augusta. It came to light that he did not want his younger daughters to marry before their elder sister Charlotte had. When Charlotte finally married in 1797, Augusta was almost 30 years old. Due to the lack of opportunity to form an acceptable marriage, Augusta found love elsewhere. She was attracted to Henry Vaughan, one of her father's doctors, which lasted some time before she formed a long-lasting relationship to Lieutenant General Sir Brent Spencer. She told her brother George about their relationship, and when he became Prince Regent, she requested his approval. She knew it would have to be private, as her mother did not approve of the match. It is possible that they got married, but it was never acknowledged. As Augusta and her sisters became older, their relationship with their mother became strained. They wanted freedom, but their mother accused them of being unloving and uncaring about their sick father. Their eldest brother George did what he could to restore peace and give his sisters more freedom, whom he adored. Her brother ascended the throne as George IV in 1820. Augusta presided over drawing rooms for her brother and fulfilled the role of hostess, left empty by his estranged wife Caroline. Augusta disliked George's mistress, Lady Conyngham, and refused to act as hostess in her presence. After the death of her father, Augusta moved into Frogmore House, which was left to her by Queen Charlotte. She became a companion for her older brother William IV's widow, Adelaide, in her early years of widowhood. Augusta passed away on the 22nd of September 1840. Princess Elizabeth was the third daughter and seventh child born to George III and Queen Charlotte. She was born on the 22nd of May 1770 and was inoculated against smallpox like her siblings. Like her sisters, Elizabeth received her education at home and received a good education. She loved music and was a gifted artist. The princesses received little freedom, and their mother restricted their every move, from what they could read to who they could talk to. Aside from the occasional outing to the theatre, the races, or visiting towns, the princesses lived a life of monotony. In 1785, Elizabeth had her coming out ball. Her dress was similar of that to her older sisters, which indicated a lack of individuality between the princesses. She walked a minuet with Lord Rochford at the ball. Elizabeth suffered from poor health and became overweight as she got older. As a result, her sisters nicknamed her Fatima. She was very sensitive and emotional. Elizabeth hoped she would marry one day and have children of her own. She drank sugar melted in water at night in the hopes that it would give her a sweet temperament, and took long walks to prevent herself from getting too overweight. She kept herself occupied, writing her mother's letters, collecting porcelain, and keeping pigs at Frogmore. Because she had no children of her own, Elizabeth looked after other people's children and devoted herself to children's charities. In 1808, the future King Louis Philippe proposed to the princess, which she wanted to accept. However, her mother refused the match due to him not being wealthy and a Catholic. Elizabeth eventually married Frederick, Landgrave of Hesse-Homburg, in 1818. She had been writing to him for 2 years. The Queen initially seemed okay with the match, but when she realised that Elizabeth would no longer be around, Charlotte acted out, refusing to agree to the match. This greatly distressed Elizabeth, and she was forced to assure her mother that she would remain in England for a while after the wedding. Frederick and Elizabeth were married on the 7th of April 1818 at Buckingham House. They honeymooned at the Royal Lodge in Windsor and spent 2 months in England. In June, they travelled to Frankfurt. Though it's not clear whether the marriage was a love match, it does appear to have been a great success. They seemed genuinely fond of each other. Unsurprisingly, their marriage produced no children. After her husband's death in 1829, Elizabeth divided her time between Homburg and Hanover. She also visited England occasionally. She died in Frankfurt am Main on the 10th of January 1840 at the age of 69. King Ernest Augustus of Hanover was the 8th child born to King George III and Queen Charlotte. He was born on the 5th of June 1771 in Buckingham Palace, then known as the Queen's House. He was raised by his governess, Lady Charlotte Finch, who served the royal family for over 30 years. After leaving the nursery, Ernest lived in a household with his younger brothers, Adolphus and Augustus, near Kew Palace, and they were educated by private tutors. In 1786, the brothers were sent to the University of Göttingen under the supervision of George Christoph Lichtenberg. In 1791, Ernest and Augustus joined the Hanoverian army and received military training from Field Marshal Wilhelm von Freytag. Ernest proved to be an excellent horseman and a good shot. After 2 months of training, he was appointed as a captain in the cavalry. In March 1792, Ernest was commissioned as a colonel of the 9th Hanoverian Light Dragoons. During the War of the First Coalition, Ernest was stationed in Flanders and served under his older brother Frederick. During military action in 1793, Ernest received a sabre wound to the head that left him with a scar. In 1794, he was hit in the left arm by a cannonball and his eyesight was also affected. He returned to England to recover, his first time being back home since 1786. He returned to military duties 3 years later in 1797. He reached the rank of Colonel of the Royal Regiment of the Horse Guards in 1827. On the 24th of April 1799, Ernest was created Duke of Cumberland and Thetfordale and Earl of Armagh. He was the least popular of his brothers and had a negative reputation. He was accused of being involved in the murder of his valet, Joseph Sellis, of having an incestuous relationship with his sister Sophia, and of being the father of her illegitimate child. It is doubtful that there was any truth to any of those allegations. In 1813, while on a visit to his uncle Karl II, Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Ernest fell in love with his first cousin Frederica of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Frederica's past romances disturbed Queen Charlotte. Frederica had married Prince Louis Karl of Prussia in 1793 and had 3 children with them. He died of diphtheria. In 1797, Frederica and Ernest's younger brother, Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, became unofficially engaged. It is unclear whether Frederica jilted Adolphus or if King George III, under pressure from Queen Charlotte, refused to consent the marriage. In 1798, Frederica became pregnant by Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Salms-Braunfels. They were forced to marry and she gave birth to a baby girl only 2 months after the wedding. They had 5 more children together who survived adulthood. Friedrich Wilhelm was an alcoholic and quit his job in the military for health reasons. He lost his income and Frederica was advised to divorce him. She was against the idea, but after meeting Ernest, she too wanted the divorce. Before they could divorce, Friedrich Wilhelm died in 1814. Ernest's older brother George became the Prince Regent in 1811, due to their father's incapacitation, and he gave his consent for the marriage. They were married on the 29th of May 1815 at the Palace of Neustrelitz. They were advised by the British Privy Council to have a second marriage in England because any child born of the marriage could eventually be close to the succession. Ernest arrived back in England in June 1815 without Frederica to make plans for their second wedding. Shortly after he arrived, Queen Charlotte sent him a letter refusing to receive Frederica because it was known in England that Frederica had broken off her engagement to Adolphus, and she warned the rest of the family that she would be greatly displeased if they received Frederica. Nevertheless, Ernest escorted Frederica to England and they had a second wedding ceremony on the 29th of August 1815 in Carlton House. Ernest's sisters felt they could not defy their mother, but his brothers, George, Frederick, William and Edward, all attended the ceremony. The couple had 1 son and 2 stillborn daughters together, Frederica, an unnamed daughter, and a son named George. The succession crisis of 1817 caused Ernest's unmarried brothers to marry to try to produce an heir. Ernest's son, George, was born 3 days after the birth of the eventual heir to the British throne, Alexandrina Victoria, who was the daughter of Ernest's older brother Edward. On the 20th of June 1837, Ernest's eldest surviving brother, William IV, died. Alexandrina Victoria became queen as Queen Victoria. Upon her ascension to the throne, Ernest became King of Hanover, as Hanover followed Salic law, barring female succession. Ernest Augustus arrived in Hanover on the 28th of June 1837 to take up his duties as the new King of Hanover and returned to England only once in 1843 for the wedding of his niece, Princess Augusta of Cambridge. Initially welcomed by cheering crowds, Ernest Augustus proved unpopular. He declared the 1833 Liberal Constitution void and restored the conservative 1819 Constitution. This change required all office holders, including professors of the University of Göttingen, to take an oath of allegiance to the king, which many refused to do. So the king expelled those most responsible from Hanover. Queen Frederica died on the 29th of June 1841 at the age of 63. Ernest had a mausoleum built for his wife and himself, which was completed in 1847. The revolutions of 1848 encouraged the citizens of German states to demand German national unity, freedom of the press, and freedom of assembly. Ernest was reluctant to agree, but to prevent revolution, Ernest agreed to the reforms. He appointed Johann Karl Bertram Stuve as the deputy of the National Assembly in Hanover, and a new constitution was created, which came into effect in 1848. Ernest's popularity increased with the new constitution. Eventually, Ernest passed away on the 18th of November 1851 after a short illness. He was buried beside his wife in the mausoleum he had built. Prince Augustus, Duke of Sussex, was born on the 27th of January 1773, the ninth of 15 children born to King George III and Queen Charlotte. Augustus was raised by the governess Lady Charlotte Finch and lived in a household with his brothers Ernest and Adolphus once he left the nursery. The brothers went to the University of Göttingen in 1786. A career in the military was considered inappropriate for Augustus, as he suffered from asthma and had poor health. His doctors advised him to avoid the winter in England, so in December 1790, Augustus moved to France and then Italy, and he would remain there for a number of years. During his travels, he met Josiah Dornford, whose father was active in prison reform. Josiah's liberal views influenced Augustus. In 1791, Augustus considered becoming a member of the clergy, and he wrote to his father for advice. His letters went unanswered, which caused Augustus to become restless. In November 1792, Augustus went to Rome, where he met a group of English aristocrats. He met Lady Augusta Murray and fell madly in love with her. Feeling like his father was not listening to him, as he did not respond to any of his letters, and like his life had no direction and no purpose, Augustus proposed to Augusta without the knowledge of anyone in the royal family, which was in contravention of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. He also did not have permission from the monarch. At first, Augusta refused because of the situation their marriage would place Augustus regarding the Marriage Act. However, this only fueled Augustus' passion, and on the 4th of April 1793, Augustus and Augusta got married in secret. In August 1793, Augustus was recalled to England because his governor, who had no idea he was married, had alerted Augustus' parents he had formed a dangerous relationship. Augusta and her mother followed him to England, and Augustus continued visiting them in their London home. By this time, Augusta was pregnant. During the summer of 1793, bonds of the marriage for the couple were read at St. George's, Hanover Square in London, under aliases. On the 5th of December 1793, Augustus and Augusta got married in England. On the 13th of January 1794, Augusta gave birth to a baby boy named after his father, Augustus Frederick. King George III was angered by this marriage and declared it null and void in August 1794. Despite this, Augustus and Augusta continued to live together, and another child, Augusta Emma, was born on the 11th of August 1801. The children were deemed illegitimate and took the surname d'Este, as both their parents were descendants of the House of Este. In 1801, the couple separated, and Augustus was created the Duke of Sussex, Earl of Inverness, Baron Arklow, and he received a grant of £12,000 a year. Augusta retained the custody of their children and received £4,000 a year. On the 5th of March 1830, Augusta died at the age of 62, which saddened Augustus. Their oldest son, Augustus, was the earliest recorded person for whom a definitive diagnosis of multiple sclerosis can be made, due to the many detailed diaries he kept for 22 years detailing all his symptoms. He died unmarried in 1848. Augusta Emma married Thomas Wilde, 1st Baron Truro. Their marriage was childless. Like her father, she suffered from asthma and spent time in the warmer climates of Europe to ease her symptoms. Augustus married again in contravention of the Royal Marriages Act. Lady Cecilia Buggin and Augustus married on the 2nd of May 1831. They lived together in Kensington Palace. After Augustus's niece Victoria ascended the throne, she bestowed the title of Duchess of Inverness on Cecilia. Victoria was fond of her uncle and he was fond of her. Victoria asked him to give her away at her wedding to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, which he happily did. He sobbed emotionally throughout the entire wedding ceremony. On the 21st of April 1843, Augustus died. Because he feared his wife would not be allowed to be buried beside him in the royal vault at St. George's Chapel, Augustus left instructions that he be buried in Kensal Green Cemetery. Cecilia continued to live in Kensington Palace until she passed away on the 1st of August 1873. Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, was the youngest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte to live to adulthood. He was born on the 24th of February 1774. Like his brothers, he was educated by tutors until he was sent away to the University of Göttingen at the age of 12. He became a Knight of the Garter in 1786 and was created Duke of Cambridge, Earl of Tipperary and Baron Culloden in 1801. Adolphus started his military training in 1791 and studied under the Hanoverian commander Field Marshal von Freytag. He participated in the Flanders campaign, in which he was wounded and captured but eventually rescued. He was promoted to lieutenant general in the Hanoverian army and participated in the War of the Second Coalition against France. In 1803, he was appointed as commander-in-chief of the newly formed King's German Legion. In 1813, he was made a field marshal. In 1816, Adolphus was appointed Governor-General of the Kingdom of Hanover. In 1831, his title was changed to Viceroy. He was a capable and efficient ruler of Hanover and remained in the position until his brother Ernest became King of Hanover in 1837. In 1817, following the death of his niece, Princess Charlotte of Wales, Adolphus went in search of a wife to provide an heir. He fell in love with Princess Augusta of Hesse Castle, and they were wed on the 7th of May 1818 and again at the Queen's House or Buckingham Palace 1st of June 1818. She was only 20 while he was 44. Despite the age difference, they had a happy marriage. They lived in Hanover from 1818 until 1837, and upon their return to England, they lived at Cambridge House and later at St. James's Palace. They had 3 children together: George, born in 1819, Augusta, born in 1822, and Mary Adelaide, born in 1833. It is through their youngest child that they are ancestors of King Charles III. On the 8th of July 1850, Adolphus passed away. He was buried in the Cambridge Mausoleum. Augustus survived him by 39 years, passing away at the age of 91 in 1889. Their remains were removed from the mausoleum and interred in the royal vault in St. George's Chapel, at the request of their granddaughter, Queen Mary. Princess Mary was born on the 25th of April 1776 and was the 11th child and 4th daughter of George III and Queen Charlotte. Mary was educated by governesses at home. She was taught languages, art, needlework and music, something Mary was skilled at. She and her sisters were given very little freedom and were restricted by their parents in what they were allowed to do. They lived very monotonous lives, which was interrupted only occasionally by an outing to the theatre or to a neighbouring town. On the 2nd of June 1788, Mary and her sisters attended a gala at Ranelagh held by the Spanish ambassador. It was very entertaining for her, and amusements included a lottery, dancing, and fireworks. Mary attended court for the first time in June 1791, and her cousin Prince William of Gloucester also made his first appearance. Mary and her family would visit Weymouth every summer from 1789 until 1805. They would swim at sea and ride donkeys. They would attend public breakfasts held by a local dignitary or go carriage riding. When it rained, they were confined indoors with nothing to do with too little space. During her sister Amelia's bout of tuberculosis, the princesses spent time in Weymouth. Mary was her sister's nurse, and they became close companions. Mary was kind and affectionate, and was her eldest brother George's favourite sister. She was described by Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the husband of Queen Victoria, as being a lady whose virtues and qualities of the heart had commanded the respect and love of all who knew her. Mary was more discreet than her sisters, but spoke her mind when necessary. On the 22nd of July 1816, Mary married William, Duke of Gloucester, her cousin. They moved into Bagshot Park. They had no children, but they had a loving marriage. They adored each other and remained constant companions. In 1834, the Duke died, and Mary moved into Gloucester House. She was the last and longest surviving child of George III, and the only one of her siblings to be photographed. She passed away on the 30th of April, 1857, at the age of 81. She was seen by her nieces and nephews as a sort of grandmother and a link to their grandfather and grandmother who had passed away when many of them were still very young. Princess Sophia was the 12th child of George III and Queen Charlotte. She was born on the 3rd of November 1777 at Windsor Castle. Like her sisters, she received an education at home under the supervision of governesses and was given very little freedom. Sophia was a passionate woman, inclined to be quite moody. She was the favourite sister of both the Duke of Clarence and the Duke of Kent. They often called her their dear little angel. Sophia's parents were fond of their daughters and were in no hurry to allow them to grow up and leave the home. Sophia and her sisters had to wait until their eldest sister Charlotte found a match before they could marry themselves, which was customary at the time. When she finally married in 1797, matches were not forthcoming for the other princesses. Perhaps if the king had remained well enough, he may have secured suitable marriages for all his daughters, but due to his deteriorating mental health, their situation was left in limbo. Sophia was not happy with her situation. She received one offer of marriage from a German prince in 1801, but her parents turned the offer down as they found him unacceptable, and she never married. Sophia did find love in life. She fell in love with one of the few gentlemen she was allowed to meet, called General Thomas Garth. He was one of the king's equerries and was 30 years her senior. There were rumours of the two marrying, but they never lived together, so it remains uncertain of whether this is true. However, there is evidence of Sophia having had an illegitimate son born in August 1800 in Weymouth, the seaside town where Sophia and her family would visit. Garth and Sophia had an opportunity to be alone together one evening while her parents were in London. 9 months later, Sophia was brought to bed, according to Lady Bath. Lady Bath had heard the news from Lady Caroline Thynne, who was mistress of the robes to the Queen, and would have been in a position to have known the truth. Fearing that the news would distress the king was told Sophia had dropsy, which was supposedly cured by eating roast beef. As the king was almost completely blind by this time and was unaware of the real state of affairs, he seemed to have accepted it as the truth. The boy was christened Thomas and was left with Major Herbert Taylor, the private secretary of the Duke of York. Garth accepted Thomas as his son and was promoted in court, obtaining a position in Princess Charlotte of Wales' household. Sophia would occasionally visit baby Thomas. An alternative story arose in which the father of the baby was Sophia's brother Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, who always had an unnatural interest in his sister. However, this was probably false. Throughout her life, Sophia suffered from spasms and depression, and as she grew older, she was forced to spend more time in bed to recover. After her mother died in 1818, Sophia inherited the lower lodge at Windsor, but chose to live in Kensington Palace, near her niece Princess Victoria. Sophia and Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, fell under the influence of John Conroy, both being charmed by his easy confidence. Conroy took control of her finances, and she helped him gain the title of Knight Commander of the Hanoverian Order. Conroy's influence over her alienated her from her niece Victoria, who despised Conroy. Sophia lived to the age of 70, passing away on the 27th of May, 1848. Prince Octavius of Great Britain was born on the 23rd of February, 1779, in Buckingham Palace. He was the 13th child of King George III and Queen Charlotte. He was his father's favourite child. His older siblings caused his father so much trouble that the king enjoyed spending time with his younger children. He often gave them presents, attended their birthday parties, and arranged special outings. Sophia, who was only 2 years older than him, was very close to Octavius and called him her son. Smallpox was a deadly disease that knew no class boundaries and killed many, leaving survivors scarred. Until the safer smallpox vaccine was developed in the 1790s, there was another way to prevent smallpox, called variolation. Live smallpox virus in the liquid taken from the smallpox blister in a mild case of the disease was put into a cut of a healthy person. About 3% of those inoculated developed a severe case of smallpox and died. But that was preferable to catching smallpox, with its mortality rate of 40%. In 1722, King George I had 2 of his grandchildren inoculated and they survived. The inoculation gained acceptance and was used until Edward Jenner developed a safer vaccination in the 1790s. Prince Octavius was one of those who did not survive the inoculation. Following the death of his brother Alfred from the inoculation in 1782, his parents waited a year before inoculating Prince Octavius and Princess Sophia. Princess Sophia recovered without incident, but Octavius became ill and died on the 3rd of May, 1783. His parents were devastated. His remains were buried in Westminster Abbey. In 1820, his remains were transferred to the royal vault at St. George's Chapel so they could rest with his parents. The youngest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte was Prince Alfred of Great Britain. He was born on the 22nd of September, 1780. He was called a blue baby, most likely due to a heart defect, and was always in delicate health. His parents thought the smallpox inoculation would help his health. In 1782, Alfred received the smallpox vaccination. He did not recover as he should have, so he was taken to Deal by the sea in the hopes that the sea air and salt water would help. However, it did not. He developed breathing difficulty and suffered from long bouts of fever. He passed away on the 20th of August 1782, shortly before his 2nd birthday. There was no formal mourning for Alfred, as it was not customary for the deaths of those under the age of 7. He was buried at Westminster Abbey. In 1820, his remains were transferred to the royal vault at St. George's Chapel. The youngest of the daughters and children of George III and Queen Charlotte, Princess Amelia was born the 7th of August 1783 in Windsor. She was born after the tragic deaths of her older brothers Alfred and Octavius, and she soon became her father's favourite child. As a young child, the king would often sit with the princess on the carpet of the nursery and play with her. Amelia grew into a graceful, beautiful woman. Her education was supervised by governesses, and she grew into quite the accomplished young woman in music, art, and needlework. She was talented at the piano and skilled at riding. Amelia's health was never robust, and in 1798 she contracted tuberculosis. By 18, she also suffered from St. Anthony's fire, a painful bacterial skin infection. To help her health, she spent time in Worthing, a seaside town. Her oldest brother George would often visit her, and they became quite close. His visits helped boost her spirit. In 1799, she recovered somewhat, and celebrations were held in Frogmore. However, her good health did not last long. By the summer, she was unable to walk for long periods of time. She stayed in Gloucester Lodge, played music, and entertained her young niece Charlotte. Bathing in salt water helped her to feel better. In 1801, Amelia fell in love with Colonel Charles Fitzroy, one of her father's equerries. He was a descendant of an illegitimate child of Charles II, and George III adored him, referring to him as Prince Charles in court. Amelia desired to marry him and tried to get support from her mother, who was against the match. Amelia never forgave her mother for this, and Amelia considered herself to be married already, and began to sign her letters as AFR, Amelia Fitzroy, from 1804. Amelia's health began to fail, and she returned to Weymouth in 1808 with her sister Mary, her faithful and devoted companion. Once she realised she was dying, she had a ring made for her father, inscribed with the words, "Remember me." When her father came to visit her, she placed the ring on his finger and he burst into tears. She left everything to Fitzroy. George, her brother, persuaded Fitzroy to renounce his claim to her belongings, and everything was given to Mary instead. On the 2nd of November, 1810, Princess Amelia died at Augusta Lodge in Windsor. The king never recovered, and he was plunged into derangement.